Thank you, Kaylin, and a warm welcome to everyone. As Kaylin says, a particularly warm welcome to all those joining from the Planning Officer Society, all of those from the AOU, and indeed anyone else who's joining as a guest. This is a very timely session, and we'll all know why in just a few moments. But the Oxford-Cambridge Arc has been spoken about for a long time. It's been on the profile of different organisations, often from different perspectives, for a few years now, but it's at a key point as a fresh document on the spatial framework is about to be launched very soon. We had hoped that we timed this event, that it would be out this week, but that's not quite the case. And we know that kind of thing happens with government, but we still think that we're very much of the moment in terms of the issues and themes to discuss. I'm just going to say a little bit about how we're going to run this before we actually start the presentations. First of all, we're trying to learn more about it, in particular, what's coming out in terms of the spatial framework, but I'm sure some of you will want to, depending on your own existing knowledge, know more about the scope and purpose of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, how it operates. I've already talked to people who are really interested in the governance and the nitty-gritty, but particularly how it translates into delivery and what that delivery means. Is it something to do with housing or the environment? Is it around infrastructure and the economy? And how can it have any influence on things like innovation, for instance? So there are a number of different elements, and obviously the focus today is coming more from the planning end, but I'm sure you'll be interested to know other elements as well. We're going to hear a little bit from Adele Maher first, and I'm going to explain that, but Adele will be saying something, I hope, about the consultation that's about to be launched. And that's a major opportunity for all of us on this session, including your colleagues in your own respective organizations, because you can input and influence the framework and the elements as they go forward. So the format is in two parts today. The first part is going to have 3 presentations from Adele Maher, as I said earlier, head of the spatial framework at the Oxford-Cambridge Arc at the Ministry. She will be followed by Steve Quartermain, former Chief Planning Officer at the Ministry and a Director of the Academy of Urbanism, head of he's actually policy lead at the Academy too. Following Steve will be Stephen Kelly, who's Director at the Greater Cambridge Authority, and he will be explaining more about the operational side from his perspective. We'll have an open Q&A in which you can all put in questions. Then we will have a break. So coming up to 3 o'clock, we'll have a break for about 10 minutes, depending on certainly it will be up to 10 minutes, no longer. And then we will go into a panel discussion with a series of other experts, including Bev Hindle, who's an Executive Director at the Oxford-Cambridge Arc Leadership Group, from Joe Lancaster, Managing Director at Huntingdonshire District Council, from Vincent Goodstadt, who's Vice President of the GCPA, and most recently, many of you will know him for his work on the UK 2070 Commission, where he's been a commissioner there. And finally, from Catriona Riddell, Catriona Riddell Associates, who has been involved in this geographical area as a strategic planning specialist for many years, and she's also a specialist advisor to the Planning Officer Society. We will also, in addition to these panelists, have an open Q&A discussion in that second part of the session. And I'll try to draw some threads, if we've got some together, as part of the close. So that's the format that we've got. It should be interesting and exciting, but that's also up to you in the audience to offer up and prompt up ideas, suggestions, questions and commentary, and the richness will come from our overall participation in this together. So if we move on, I'm going to introduce Adele first. And Adele has been working, I think, for about 6 months at the Ministry on this work, and she's going to give us the latest position, which is an update, I think, on the one from earlier in the year. So a warm welcome to Adele. We're delighted that you're able to join us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Hello there. Hi, everybody. I've got a presentation that I'd like to take you through, and the Academy are going to help me with the slides. So,
okay, Adele, when you're ready.
Yeah, it's not on the full slide mode yet, but I can start away. As Kevin said, I'm Adele Maher. I'm the head of the Spatial Framework. The Spatial Framework is something that's been led by the government, and so me and the team are based at MHCLG, That's the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And a big thanks to the Academy for extending the invitation to me and the team to present to you at this event. It's a great opportunity for us to talk to you about the spatial framework. And in particular, we have a consultation that we hope to launch very, very soon. So I'd like to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about that. And kind of as an overview, the structure of my presentation is going to tell you a little bit more about the ARC and the spatial framework. Then I'll tell you a little bit more about kind of the process and the principles that will be underpinning its preparation. And then I'll tell you more about that consultation I was talking about, which is focused on creating the vision for the spatial framework. So if I can go on to the next slide, which is going to give you a bit of an introduction. So you may or may not have seen this before, but it's lovely to see it kind of geographically. It's a very big area. It's a very broad area, full of fantastic diversity, assets that we want to kind of treasure and build upon. But why are we talking about this area at all? Why are we here? And really, government has identified this as being a unique opportunity. And a unique one, for a national economic priority area, because defined as such because of that opportunity. So it's incredibly productive, the area. As the slide tells you, it's second to London kind of nationally in terms of its productivity. But there's an opportunity for the area to do even better than it's doing today. And looking to 2050 with the right support, we think that we can double the economic output of the area. And that's big news. You know, it was big news back in 2016, 2017, when the National Infrastructure Commission identified this potential. But even bigger news now, and more important news now, particularly as we look to recover from COVID and the impact it's had on our economy. So going on to the next slide, just telling you a little bit more about government getting involved in planning and why planning is seen as particularly important in this area. Just thinking about that map, and you saw kind of some lines and divisions within that. Given the scope of the area, there are a lot of different authorities who operate and are responsible for planning their areas. But in order to make the most of this potential on behalf of the national economy, it's right to think about planning for that at an arc-wide level, on this area level, and to kind of bring it up and to look at coordinating across those boundaries. Kevin kind of made the point earlier about what is this going to cover and contain. But as a spatial plan, it will cover those kind of important aspects of the economy, placemaking, the environment, connectivity, but very much this plan is going to be focused on delivery too. So looking at infrastructure and how the growth and potential to 2050 is going to be supported is going to be a critical part of getting this right. I think looking at what we can do together with our local partners, I guess the potential that was first identified by the National Infrastructure Commission has been discussed with those local areas who have such an important role in guiding its future. And kind of together, there was an agreement through a joint declaration that the spatial framework provided an opportunity to coordinate and together work to make this place a brilliant place to live, work and travel in. I guess also looking at the spatial framework and thinking back to the publication of the white paper last year, it also provides us a great opportunity at a government level to look at the tools and techniques we're going to use to develop this plan, and perhaps set a kind of a marker on how future plans could be developed too. So just going into the next slide on the spatial framework itself and the planning kind of bit, what it is. So the spatial framework is going to be national planning policy for the ARC, so for that specific area, and it's also going to act as national transport policy. And what that means in effect is that it's a material consideration. So when local areas come to develop plans, like their development plans, including local plans and neighbourhood plans, also on the strategic or on the local transport planning side, the content of this spatial framework will need to be taken into account. And that's important because it affects decision making. and that's decision making on applications for development in the future, but also it'll help guide investment decisions, both at the kind of national level, and we think we'd like to influence it at a local level too. I guess it's important to say on that, this isn't intended to replace local plans. Local plans have their place and their function. The ideal is that these two work together and complement one another to deliver best on behalf of kind of the Arc, the communities within the Arc, and on behalf of the country too. And so that distinction means it's not part of the statutory development plan. So local areas retain that. So going on to the next slide, just to tell you a little bit about how we're preparing it. And we included this in our February launch paper, so I should have referred to that back in the last slide. So the government's committed in budget 2022 to develop the spatial framework for the reasons set out. Following that up in February this year, we published a policy paper, and that set out our ambitions for the spatial framework, and also gave some detail on what it was going to include. We've lost some of the slides, but I'm okay with that. Will I pause until they're back up? Can everyone else see them?
Kaylin's just having a bit of a problem with her connection, so we're hopefully going to get your slides back any second, Adele.
Okay. I'm happy to continue
if you're happy to continue without your slides for now, then that would be great. Oh, I think there we go.
Thanks, Kaylin.
Sorry, my internet's a bit unstable here. Are we moving on from this slide? Sorry, Adele.
Yeah, we're on the next one. Thanks, Kaylin.
Perfect, no problem.
Lovely. So that policy paper in February told you what the spatial framework, a little bit more about it. And I guess it's fair to say it is different. You know, there's no neat template that we're following preparing this. And, you know, that's a challenge, but it also brings fantastic opportunities for us. And I think, as I said, it is government led, but we firmly believe in government for this to work best on behalf of the area and on behalf of the kind of the country as well. It needs to be produced through collaboration, and that's collaboration with the wider public and also with those kind of important policy makers within the area too. So that's very much one of the principles that underpin this. I guess the other bit is the adaptable aspect of this. You know, as a plan maker, an experienced plan maker, it's very tricky producing a plan when things are changing. And we have the planning reforms in the horizon. And I think in producing this plan, we need to make sure it effectively bridges what is currently operating and what happens in the future. So we provide some certainty for local areas and local authorities producing plans, and also for kind of decision makers and investors in the area. So it's really important that that will be part of its development. Long term, the plan looks to 2050. And I think when you're looking at delivery and investment and the opportunity that the spatial framework brings to coordinate on behalf of this bigger area, you know, long term is really important when you're looking at infrastructure, particularly big infrastructure. And we think looking at that 2050 horizon helps us to understand the challenges that the area faces and the investment decisions that will need to be taken to support future growth. The integrated aspect of that, I think it's very much looking at, I guess, making sure that the transport aspect in particular is more integrated in this area and rather than separated. And I think sustainability is something that's important to have at the core of this document. So alongside our summer consultation, we've also developed an essay scoping report and setting out how we hope to make this a key part of our kind of policy development at this stage and also going forward. Digital first, I think, you know, over the last year, how we work is very different. And I think looking at how we consult on this plan, we also want to take that digital first aspect into this engagement process, but also looking at the legacy that we're going to create for this plan, the gathering of evidence, the investment in the production of that evidence. It's important that it has value and we want it to last. So we're looking at how we might make that happen. On the evidence-based side, for it to have value and really to to kind of have an effect in the short and to medium term, it's really important that the evidence we produce is robust. So local plans and other development plans can take this on board and run with it. So that's an important consideration for us. The quality of things, I think it's something we've talked locally about. It's really important that this is about setting high standards, not talking about the minimum, kind of lowering the bar. And so that's something that we will need to explore as we're developing our policies. And I think we're really aware of the, the tremendous kind of assets within the existing areas. And it's important that those are protected and enhanced through this plan, and that we build on those and the environmental aspects as part of the spatial framework. So adding value is key. Why bother doing this otherwise? And as part of that, we'll be looking to existing evidence and existing plans to make sure we build on those rather than duplicate. So going on to the next slide, please, Kaylin, and the timetable. So in that February paper, we set out our timetable, and I'm pleased to say we're on track. So far, so good, and we hope to launch our consultation, as I said, very, very soon. We are early in the process too, and we're looking at quite a bit of to go. But as I said, we feel it's really important at this stage to open up and to engage with the wider community, and that's going to be the focus of our summer consultation this year. So going on to that summer consultation and telling you a little bit more about it, which is on the next slide, please. Thank you. I guess the spatial framework, I give you a little bit of an overview of what it is, but where do you start with something like this? And how do you talk to the wider public about something like this? Even for us as planners and urban designers, it's kind of hard to get your head around. So we kind of really thought about that and had early conversations with kind of a wide-ranging audience in the spring of this year, taking kind of a sample of the audience we expect to engage with this summer. And we kind of asked them just that. We want to develop a vision. We want to develop a vision for the Arc and Spatial Framework. How do we talk to you and people like you in order to make this consultation a success? And it was a really valuable exercise and testing that we did, and we think it's going to help make this consultation that we will soon launch even better for it. I think really interestingly on it, and maybe not surprisingly too, people weren't in the wider kind of community weren't aware of the Arc and didn't know what the spatial framework was. But when we explained what it was about and how the policies in this plan would have an effect on their lives and their communities' lives, they really cared and wanted to be involved and wanted to have an influence. I think on that, people had different views on how they wanted to engage, and it really was kind of wide-ranging views, but people were quite clear to come direct to me where you can. I think the challenge for us in this consultation as well, when you're doing planning and it is a spatial framework, is that words like spatial framework are off-putting to people. So I think we've kind of worked in the preparation of our consultation material to kind of overcome that challenge and to make the language as accessible and simple as we possibly could. So I think the outputs of that, we've just taken a lot on board. And I guess what it also kind of helps to underline is this is something that we will continue as we engage. This one will be the first of 3 consultations that we will be running on the spatial framework. And it's very much about learning at each of those points and doing it better the next time around. So going on to the next slide then, to tell you a little bit about the consultation that we will be running. It is focused on creating the vision. Now, those of you who've been involved in kind of plan making on the either plan maker as a plan maker or responding, you know that when these plans start, you usually are presented with a ready-made vision. And it was something we thought about in the preparation. Is it right to come with a ready-made vision with a plan like this? And I think looking back in the February paper, government's ambitions are very clear in it, but it is government's ambitions. And we think it's really important that we start this and start everybody at the same place with this conversation. and ask everybody equally, what is your vision for the Arc to 2050? And then also explaining why it's important that they get involved in a vision. You know, vision, it's not just meaningless words in a spatial plan. It's really important because it provides the steer for all policies that it's going to contain. So this is a really important first step for us, and that's why it's really important for us that we reach as many people in the Arc and with an interest in the Arc at this stage as we can. So within the consultation document, we tell people that, why it's important. We tell them what a vision should be. We do want it to be aspirational. We want it to be ambitious. I think if just thinking about what this place could be to 2050, we really need to think transformationally as well, and to think big. But it's really important, you know, to open it up, but also to emphasize that there will be a need to be realistic in the spatial framework. It will only be able to do so much in its planning role. And as I said in the principles, that bit about collaboration is really important. If for this to work, and to work as well as it could on behalf of everyone, it needs to be a shared vision, and that's what we're setting out to develop and do. So going on to the next slide, it gives you a little bit more just about kind of the dates. So as I said, we'll do 3 rounds of consultation, and this is the first. We would like to do 12 weeks of consultation for each of those. And I think particularly this year, starting in the summer, I expect that, you know, there might not be anybody around in August who will respond. So thankfully we'll be looking at events and engagement in September too. Looking at the digital first side of things and learning from the feedback we had through earlier consultation, we know how important and, you know, fantastic those digital means and methods are at engaging people in new conversations, and particularly in planning. And so we've developed a dedicated platform to host this consultation, and done some user testing to refine how we're kind of phrasing things and presenting things to effectively maximize reach and encourage people to respond. I guess on the vision and the views, as I said, it really is about what is your vision to 2050. What we found through the early engagement also on a big question like that is people have different ways that they engage with it. Some people like to be asked a big question, what's your vision? Others like to think about it in the context of now. So what are the issues and opportunities now? Or what are your hopes and fears in relation to now? Others then are more practical and want to know, what is it going to do? So what are the priorities? What are the doing bits of this vision? And so the approach to the questions that we've set out in this consultation, it contains a mix of all of those things. And then just going on to the last slide. As I said, the way we've set it up is to encourage as many people to engage in this as possible, and to really reach as far as we can and engage with people who normally don't engage in planning, either plan making or decision making. And we want to make sure that people have an opportunity here to shape what these policies are going to do, and how that will influence development and investment to 2050. I guess this is also an opportunity for me to ask you in advance to please engage in this consultation. The opportunities to transform are there for all of us, and you know, we are very open to taking on board everybody's feedback to this consultation, and that helping shape the direction of the spatial framework and its content. Going forward, the next steps, so we'll take the feedback from this consultation, we'll create a vision. From there, we'll start to develop policy and policy options, and then we will take that out to consultation. Next spring is our indicative date, spring 2022, to engage people on that. And following that consultation, we will then aim to kind of finalize our draft in autumn of next year, and publish soon after, we hope. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Adele. Thanks for giving us that update on where you are, and obviously we're looking forward to the substantive content coming out as soon as possible. Lots of themes and issues that people would like to engage with, and we'll try to pick up those both in the discussion this side of the break and afterwards. I'm going to move now on to our next presenter in this part, and that's Steve Quartermain, recently Chief Planner and also, as many of you will know, a Director of the Academy of Urbanism. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And Kaylin, if you could go to my slide, people will be perhaps. I'm going to try and speak off one slide. There's much merit in this approach, and you know, I'm a fan of bigger than local planning, and I want to say from the beginning that there's nothing in my questions that should be interpreted as sort of undermining the fact that this actually could be a really good idea, and if it worked, it could be really beneficial. But it is and the fact the approach may well be a model for sort of elsewhere in the country, and that might be something we come back to later in today. But I have got some questions, and I've always tried to when I'm looking at policy development, policy thinking, one of the things that I always used to try and bring to the discussion was the simple question, which was, well, how does this work? How's this going to work? How are you actually going to implement this? Because turning the good ideas and the rhetoric and the sort of big ideas into practical delivery is something which needs to be on the government's to-do list. And I've already seen in the chat box a number of questions which cross-reference to some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. To be honest, there's probably a million questions, but I've chosen 10, which I think I'll start with, and no doubt people today might want to add to the list. And of course, some of these questions don't have simple sort of light switch answers. It's not just a simple question. And some of these questions, I think later on today, will say have begun to be answered. So do see it in that context. So I want to start by talking about status and the status of this document. Adele talked about this being a material consideration as opposed to a section 38.6 issue. It's not a statutory document. And I can understand why the government might want to sort of sidestep the statutory plan process, but putting it in the NPPF and making it the NPPF national planning policy policy for this area has some issues which need to be resolved. So whilst it's a material consideration, we know from experience, from if you look at the existing NPPF, it has lots of things in it that says that the local planning authorities should do now. But to be honest, they don't always, and they don't always do it in the way in which the NPPF was sort of intending. So there is an issue about the weight and how you actually ensure that the whatever comes out of this framework is considered and taken into account, not only in plan making but in decision making. And I think there needs to be an understanding about what that status is. I want to talk about the content of the plan, and that's linked. And the ambition, as in Adele's slide, is great. Economic development, prosperity, a sort of coordinated approach to housing, jobs, the way people live in the Arc. But I have to say that I've said this before about local plans. That sort of a vision that doesn't have reality is an illusion, and I think you've got to really think about how the plan content is going to go beyond the rhetoric and beyond the actual we want to make this place more prosperous and the like, to actually how that's going to be delivered, and of course that content then needs to be coordinated. And that brings me to my point 3, is as Adele says, that it doesn't replace local plans. Local plans will be sitting underneath this framework, and of course we need to sort of coordinate the content of those various plans, obviously to try and make sure that the framework ambition and vision is delivered through the plans, which needs to be sort of regarded across the Arc. And I think that the way in which that has happened in the past is not doesn't always have a good track record, and you've only got to look at the attempts, the valiant attempts in Greater Manchester to produce a joint plan to see that you've already had one authority remove itself from that plan process. And so this idea of trying to coordinate the content, trying to make sure that each authority recognises what role it's got to play in delivering that is a challenge, and we need to understand that we need to make that link as strong as we can make it. I also think that timing is an issue for those local plans. It's not like we have a big bang date where all these local plans are going to start afresh from a given date. We've already got the framework taking until 2023 to be published. I know that it's going to be ready by the autumn of 22, but it's probably going to be likely early 23 at the earliest before we actually see the framework. So there's a bit of a question about, well, what's happening in the interim to local plan preparation, and some thought needs to be given to that. And I also think that across the Arc, if we're going to try and see the ambition and vision of the Arc delivered, there needs to be some mechanism to better coordinate the content and timing of the various plans that are spread across the Arc to try and ensure that this overall vision can still be seen and can actually seem to be delivered. And so there needs to be, I think, a joint framework, and there are some a framework for timing, for the timescale, and I think that there's some work to be done to try and align that up locally. And of course, that links to performance. I say that plans are all about delivery, and it shouldn't just be about vision. But one of the things that I think needs to be answered is how the various plans in the meantime are going to be regarded in terms of their delivery. Plans have big ambition, and I think that's great. We should have ambitious plans, and I've seen the recently published Oxford document, which has various options, 5, I think. 3 of them include potential new settlements, and I think it's great that this debate is taking place. But of course, in the meantime, you've got a sort of elsewhere in the jungle, you've got plans being judged against their performance, about how many houses are being delivered, what is your performance against your housing delivery test, what is your 5-year land supply, councils are losing appeals because they don't have 5-year land supply. And some of these issues need to be addressed. If this vision is going to be delivered across the Arc, we need to come up with a process of dealing with that. And I think that, as I said, some of these questions have begun to be answered. And in the Oxford, there was a reduced 5-year land supply, if you remember, down to 3. And although the timetable to produce the plan has been extended, as I understand it, the 5-year land supply sort of deal has not. So there are some very practical issues that need to be very clear about in terms of how this is going to be delivered. And that brings me to 6, and I've only got 10 minutes, so 10 questions in 10 minutes, so I'm trying to get through them all. The examination. We need to help PINs. If PINs are going to be examining these various plans, I think the current MPPF has talked about how PINs should test soundness in plans. And I've recently written an article about whether that soundness test needs to be revisited, particularly when you've got big ambition and when you're looking at infrastructure provision and the funding for infrastructure provision. The current test about deliverability and viability, as we saw in North Essex, has proven to be a high bar to jump and to clear, because some of these questions can't be answered in the detail that sometimes we think that the PINS inspectors are looking for. So there is this issue about the ambition, and if we want the PINS inspectors to be examining plans and finding them sound, then there needs to be a bit of a tweak to the way in which that is approached. And that brings me to infrastructure, and I think Adele's made the point about infrastructure and the need to coordinate the delivery. And whilst that will be picked up by the examination, it does need to be picked up in terms of how utilities and the government better coordinate the funding and forward planning of delivery. And I've seen in the chat box questions about water supply, sewerage, and it's not just roads and the like, but that needs to be better coordinated. There needs to be a process by which that is delivered in a timely way, because otherwise some of this ambition will be held up. And in terms of the governance, again, a couple of questions in the chat box talked about this, like, you know, who's actually in charge of this, and I think that there's a question there that there is a governance regime, and I've seen that. But of course, the bottom line is, in any governance, you've got to talk about whether or not there's any accountability. Who's accountable for the actual delivery, and I think that's going to be one of the important points. And my 9th point about resilience is important because things change, and we've seen things change politically up and down the country. And I always used to we talk about York's troubles in getting a local plan in place, but I always used to do so with an understanding about, well, the people that were working to try and get a plan in place were facing a political change quite often, which then meant the plans that they thought they were going to get over the line were suddenly recast and said, well, that's not my plan, I want a different plan. Across the Arc, there's potential for that change to occur. We've seen changes in Oxford and the like. I just think that we need to think about what is the resilience for this framework. How do we try and make sure that even within that framework, if there are changes, are we talking about the flexibility to revisit elements of this? How are we going to actually deal with, over this time period, that there will be change? Because there will be change, and I think that the government needs to think about that now. And then finally, I think the it's my last point, but it's actually a point which again has been picked up in the chat room, and I think it's critical to the whole process. It's this community engagement. I mean, are we is Adele talking about a consultation or a communication? Are we communicating to the people that this is what's going to happen, or are we going to say, you know, we want you to be involved with by partly of the engagement, shaping this and actually bringing it forward, which is what the white paper talked about. Local plans being community-led and the community engagement being upfront. And I think there's an issue here about how the government segues that into this thinking. Now, Kevin, I feel that those were 10 questions I needed to ask. They're not the only questions, and there'll be other questions that people want to pose. Some of those questions, I'll readily admit, are partly answered, but I just don't want to lose sight of them. And I think that we'll pick this up in the discussion. But I've done my 10 questions in 10 minutes, so that's all I need to say.
Thank you, Steve. Adele set us out on the broad vision track and took us through the principles behind it. You've taken us back down to reality, Steve, with some very practical questions, particularly looking at it from a local authority and an existing local development plan system. We're now going to move on from your challenging questions to hear a bit more about how things might be and indeed are being approached. We're going to hear from Stephen Kelly, who's director at the Greater Cambridge Authority. Many of the people on this session know Stephen well and indeed have worked with him. Welcome, Stephen. The way we've heard the first two presentations, it sounds like you're in quite a challenging position in terms of the complexity and the dynamic shifts and in the aspirations that you're grappling with. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Stephen.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And I've been watching some colleagues and comments from a number of people in the chat. So I'll aim to not repeat some of the similar questions and inquiries in some respects that I've got from that Steve has posed. But I wanted to just, I've said looking upwards, is actually looking across the Arc, but from the perspective of the local authority faced with preparing local plans, and indeed with some of Cambridge's Greater Cambridge's quite challenging issues. I thought it would be useful to consider context and a few reflections on that before, I suppose, taking a view about what is the potential purpose, and certainly our ambitions for what the purpose and the merits of wider collaboration on this kind of geography could be, and the potential role before, and I'll try not to repeat some of the questions that Steve has perhaps already raised, before just posing a series of questions that we are currently wrestling with around the proposal. So if we can move to the next slide briefly. The fundamental point, I suppose, that as a district council, I'm responsible for 2 district council planning services, but which Greater Cambridge as a place faces, is life is very complicated. This isn't the only ARC, in fact, that we face. We've got one going down to London, there's one going across to Norwich, Ipswich, and upwards with our partners in Cambridgeshire and the combined authority to Peterborough and beyond. So some way of making sense of some of that becomes very important. Likewise, if we move to the next, I think some people are not muted, certainly for me. If we move on to the next slide, this is something I use with my students, but fundamentally there is a question mark about the delivery process. As you can see from my slide, I have several tiers of decision making and public authorities, and not only government from the top, but also the ARC and subnational transport boards, which don't necessarily align, and county combined authorities. Of course, we have a city deal, and below that our spot at the as district authorities, and below that neighbourhood platforms, parish councils, and so on. So there is a complex delivery process, and it's in that context that I've started to try and give some thought, or the authorities have started to try and give some thought about, so how do we make something from this programme that, as people are quite rightly highlighting, has the potential to be a big government project, but a project nevertheless that we feel may well be important in helping us to address some issues. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So, and these are just, in a sense, I should say, these are my personal reflections. I don't have a mandate from my council leaders to say this, but certainly as a planner practicing for over 30 years, and with a little bit of history in terms of these grand growth programs, certainly as part of the growth agenda and the ODPM's ambitions at that time, I think there are several potential roles for this piece of work. And as you'll see, I'll come to a series of questions about how successfully we think, or questions about how well that could be fulfilled. But they clearly have a role with the loss of structure plans, with the absence, unlike Scotland and Wales, of a national plan. And people have talked about levelling up in the chat. There is an important gap, I think, at the moment around the discussion around big spatial planning, about subnational spatial planning and the role of different settlements. And that also drives, in fact, some of the debates that then follow about infrastructure and about the country's economic growth. And I think there is a potential role for the ARC programme to describe that and indeed convene, as I said, the conversation, the important conversation that's necessary as we head forward to a kind of post-recovery context. And in that regard, I certainly believe that there is an important role in bridging between the national and the local interests. So both playing the conversation upwards from the very diverse entities that arguably inhabit the ARC, upwards into government, but also engaging in what I think is a really important and constructive discussion downwards about how those national and local interests come together. Not least because, of course, planning has that wider public role, that wider public interest, which goes beyond the kind of local into the national and international agendas on things like climate change and so on. So the third potential role I think it has is about helping to confirm the narrative about a place. There's some very powerful things that I've read from people in the past. So Harvey McGrath, who did some work on the actually innovation corridor study, quite clearly articulating that for the UK to be globally competitive, we need to present in a coherent and cogent way if we're to avoid the need for big government and to ensure that local agencies can coordinate and speak with effective voice at an international scale. And as I've touched upon, an opportunity for some genuine spatial planning to take place. The other thing that, having wrestled with issues like trying to drive down water consumption standards, to try to enhance biodiversity net gain, to seek to argue for quality and so on, the document has an opportunity to do some of that heavy lifting. That means that me and my planning team in the examination process are not solely the voice in that space. We can be supported by national policy. I've put a question about it's important, and Adele's referred to the fact that it is evidence driven. There's probably a point about whose evidence, but it's nevertheless potentially a way of efficiently bringing evidence to the fore, particularly when it comes to the next point around infrastructure planning and some of the privatized utilities' ability to be able to get a consistent and coherent picture to engage with regulators on the matters of things like long-term planning for utilities, power and water infrastructure, which has been difficult. And there's also a role, I think, in enriching the discussion around delivery. This is, we in our part of the ARC are facing lots of proposals for big new settlements, but there's a fundamental realism, which is that it's not the size of the settlements, it's the pace at which homes are delivered that is the challenge facing many of us across the ARC, and building or suggesting to build many thousands of new homes in one big lump doesn't actually necessarily solve it. If we can move to the next slide. So what I'd like to do is just pose a few questions, and as I said, I'm conscious of time, Kevin, so I'm anxious not to dwell too much. The questions I had around scope and boundaries in many respects are similar to Steve's questions about status and content and who writes what and where does that ambition translate into hard, tangible policy, so that case officers dealing with developers on planning applications and communities seeking to try and make sense of proposals that come in can rely upon and land upon concrete and tangible support. There is also the point around lessons from history. I was reading the regional spatial strategies and the Milton Keynes South Midlands sub-regional strategy, and many of the words that are contained in the Oxcam project are in fact almost drawn out of that 2004 document. And I think it's important that we reflect really carefully about why those projects perhaps under-delivered against their objectives and make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. Steve's covered the issue of local plan preparation. I was going to touch upon examination, but he's covered that. And I think we've seen in the chat questions about how collaborative is it, who and how are decisions made, and how much information do people have to do that. And I think that's one of the lessons from the RSS and MKSM experience, is whether or not people feel locally invested and indeed included in that process. And there is inevitably that question then about this is complicated and how accessible and inclusive and engaging is it? And through the growth boards and the discussions around the various work streams that I'm sure we'll come to, how do communities understand what is being made and said on their part? There is a question for me as well about cross-government commitment. That really very much comes back from my experiences in MKSM, in which MHCLG, or ODPM as it was fully committed to the project. But Department for Transport, some of the other providers, and indeed utility providers, were far less invested or felt obliged to be invested in that outcome. And you know, we certainly in the eastern end of the ARC, with challenges around water and seeking to address a wide range of utility and community infrastructure, we need that join up. There's the diversity of geography, which is both enriching and indeed economies, but also how is viability going to be applied? How are we going to resolve some of those issues around values and what is affordable in terms of perhaps stretching environmental goals in one part of the ARC may well be less deliverable in those others. And we need to make sure that we're not essentially, as the SIL regulations generally tend to do, dumbing down ambitions across that platform. How do we do that? How do we maintain local commitment, not just in terms of partners, but Steve touched upon this in terms of consistency of approach. And what about the timetable? I'm about later on this summer, early autumn, to publish a preferred option document. But when I started this process, I envisaged I would have other documents sitting alongside me. How do we make sure that there is coherence so that communities can feel confident in the process and the joins between all of that work? And a couple of kind of perhaps more broader points. This requires a lot of work from local authorities. You know, I'm lucky to have a very able and experienced and capable team. Not all local authorities will be able to rely upon that. And indeed, the capacity of local partners and local authorities acting on behalf of their constituents and supporting and being supported by those constituents, it is likely to be quite a challenge as we head into what is going to be a very complex and richly engaging time. And then the kind of outlier there, what happens with planning reform to those local plan processes? What does the scope and status of the document mean as we head into potentially the proposals outlined in the white paper, which are very much plan-led, rather than allowing for those checks and balances down the line. So Kevin, that was all I had. I'm sorry I probably took slightly longer, but I will stop there. Thank you. Thanks,
Stephen. I'm conscious that we're running over, but there's a lot of detailed content in this that some of it is actually responding to the Q&A live as it comes in, and I'm sure we'll continue that as we go into the second half too. I'm going to pick up some of the ones coming through. So firstly, for Adele, can you say a little bit more about the consultation? Because I think some people seem to think there is already a sort of fixed down vision and it's being sold to people. Just want to get a sense the degree to which the vision, and if you can, I'm assuming you can say something about this, is articulated, but is also being built up from whatever the contributions are. So my question is along the lines, building from those who are wanting to find out more about it. Is it fixed or is it open? Are there quite a lot of opportunities for those who may wish to contribute during those 12 weeks to feed ideas in?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, it is open, and that's why we're taking this approach to this consultation. I guess the ARC and its potential, and the potential for government to take a lead and intervene in this has been discussed for many years now. And I guess the ambitions that we set out in the paper, you know, and going back to budget 2020, government has committed to producing the spatial framework as a government-led document, but in collaboration with local partners, and doing that through a collaborative approach. Now, how you do that when it's government-led is very difficult. And I guess that is why, in deciding what form it would take, respecting the roles of the local plans and the authority of those local areas and the local planning process to still control and shape their areas when it comes to detail, it has been retained. And so there are no policies in the spatial framework. And the vision is the start of what shaping those policies and what that content should be. So it's an open and starting everyone at the same place process.
Okay, so the consultation and the engagement that's referred to, that some people I think there hasn't been any, that's really starting whenever the button presses in the next few weeks.
Yeah, so the engagement that we did in March was taking a sample of who our potential audience could be in this consultation and working out how do we talk about something like a spatial framework? How do you talk about something that's government led in a way that people understand? So it was a testing process for this engagement and helped effectively shape how we are presenting the material and how we're starting this conversation.
Thanks, Adele. And I mean, we've got comments on ranging from housing to carbon to water and waste. Those are some of those elements already under discussion in terms of advanced stakeholders, or will some of that be played in as things work through over the next cycle and indeed cycles? So I'm thinking of both public and private agencies.
Yeah, I guess it's worth saying that, because it is national planning policy and national transport policy, obviously we will be looking to kind of across other government departments to policies that are progressing and ambitions and proposals that are progressing, and making sure that that is going to be reflected in the policy content that we're developing. I guess when we look to local areas and discussions that have already taken place, we're fortunate that there are groups of people who are coming together already to set out what they want to see through the spatial framework. So, for example, the Arc Leaders group have produced an economic perspective and environmental principles as well that are pushing kind of to us what a collective group of local authorities would like to see in the spatial framework.
Thanks, Adele. I'm going to go to Stephen next, because there are a number of these other elements. And at the moment, I'm not going out to any of the audience directly, but partly just to try and catch up time before we have a short break. But there are a number of other strands beyond the plans themselves. The components of the plans are referred to. Stephen, you referred to some that you're grappling with. Are there anywhere operating at this scale? Because if I can say, some of the people on the call are clearly skeptics of either regional planning or if not regional planning, this particular ARC. Is there anything where, whether it's biodiversity or carbon, or where you see that there are clear benefits from the engagement and collaboration that you referred to at the start of your presentation?
So, thanks, Kevin. Certainly, and I mean, I think the chat actually highlights, there's quite a few people from Cambridgeshire I noticed, but the chat actually highlights some of the difficulties that, in a sense, the current framework has created. So if we look at water resource planning, it is not within the gift of district councils to plan water resources, and that subnational activity and the trading and movement of water and its treatment requires a bigger conversation with a wider range of agencies as part of resolution. Likewise, in respect of approaches to biodiversity net gain, or indeed some of the ways in which we're going to deliver improved reduced carbon emissions. Local planning authorities, sitting in public inquiries up and down the country, are very poorly placed to insist upon a tailored and specific approach. I think Kevin or Adele might have referred to the environment principles that have been agreed across the ARC, which in a sense do much of the heavy lifting. What we now need to do is to make sure that those principles then facilitate alignment of all of the agencies of government with sufficient determination, and whether that be working with the privatized utilities around water, or indeed working at kind of on green infrastructure to try and ensure that district and county boundaries don't actually impede the effective planning and management of both landscapes and biodiversity.
Stephen, just while you're on, I've got a slightly naughty one that you will have probably seen, which is that you said you're part of several ARCs in terms of your authority's area. And the question was, has one of them got greater significance than the others? It's less about the answer, but the fact that the Oxford-Cambridge ARC is not a singular ARC. There are other strategic corridors and so on, and some of them have been around for a longer time frame. and that's valid in terms of thinking about strategic planning in a wider perspective. But do you find there's any competition, or are these complementary, either spatial axes or however you might want to describe them in your area?
I think that actually it's an interesting debate that we've had, which is about what are the most significant corridors and arcs, and more importantly, and it goes to the kind of infrastructure planning within them, is what is the relationship of each place? You could ask the same question about Milton Keynes, you know, and its relationship on the M1 corridor and so on, and so I think there's an importance of national discussion that we can't be we can't fully resolve on our own around the respective function of these different places, and I'm sure we might touch upon that in the second session with people like Vincent and Catriona and others. But I don't think I would say one is more important than the other. I think it's actually what is important is that we work out the role and function of places within those corridors.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm just going to go a quick question to Steve Quartermain before we take a break. Steve, you talked about a number of questions. I think most of us in the room hearing them, they're very practical. They're focused on plans and almost the legality and status of those plans. Do you think that the concept that we're hearing about the spatial framework needs to embed itself, you know, deeper in the statutory system, rather than, I think as some people on the session might argue later, a lighter touch concept that sits above, has some material influence, but it's not such a controlling influence over local development plans and, let's say, housing numbers and things like that? Are you saying it's got to try and find a way to become more firmly embedded in the statutory system?
Not really, Gavin. I mean, it can be, but it can equally be this light touch overarching document. We've done it before, the sort of Northern Gateway type thing. The question is, how effective was that? Did that actually lead to real change? Were plans actually related to it? Did they deliver? And I suppose, you know, the reason I focus on practicalities is you know, to make the link to communities. Communities have a right to expect that if they've got a plan, then what's in a plan gets delivered and what isn't in a plan doesn't. And I think that if you're going to have a system which says, well, let's imagine that you know, one of the Oxford options is a new settlement, and I'm not saying whether that's the case, but if they end up with a new settlement, then the practical questions that flow from that is, well, does that suck in local housing need from a number of authorities? What is the implication of that on 5-year land supply? Because that affects things like decisions that are taken by the council and appeal decisions. And I think communities have got a right to know how this will affect planning going forward in the future, because the worst case scenario is they get a light touch plan which envisages an ambitious array of new development, and they're also seeing their councils having to approve schemes in every village, every market town, and they're losing appeals, and that's a double whammy. And I think that's that's the issue that I'm trying to highlight. There just needs to be a practical and pragmatic approach, which they can do. They can pick this up themselves in the MPPF, actually.
Thanks, Steve. So you're coming at it from a transparency and legitimacy and impact point of view, rather than, let's say, defending one form of system or the other. That's really helpful, Steve. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to suggest we pause for 5 minutes, take a comfort break. On my clock, it's 3:05. We're going to restart at 3:10, and we've got our panelists, and we'll continue with the discussion, picking up themes that are coming through in the chat. Thanks everyone for putting things into the chat, and thanks very much to our first 3 presenters. I hope everyone's going to stay for the second half, but this is just to give everyone a short comfort break if you want to get a coffee or stretch in your seat, whatever it is, but we'll reconvene at 3:10. Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone's managed to have a quick break and we're all getting ready for the next session. Just checking, Kaylin, everything's okay?
Yeah, all good.
Thanks, Kaylin. We're now going to move on in this second part of the session to hear from 4 panelists. I'm actually going to take the second 2 in a different order. So we're going to take Catriona before Vincent, but we're going to start with Bev Hindle, who's the Exec Director at the Oxford-Cambridge Arc Leadership Group. Then we're going to move on to Joe Lancaster, MD at Huntingdonshire District Council, but also a sponsor of the Arc Place workstream, and there was reference to work streams earlier. Then we're going to hear from Catriona Riddell in terms of the experience and perspective of someone who's been deeply involved in strategic planning in the Greater Southeast for some years. And then Vincent Goodstadt, who, as many of you will know, not only has been working nationally at the UK 2070 Commission, he's also been heavily involved in large-scale regional planning in places like Glasgow and the Clyde Valley, but also working with others at an international level on this. So first to Bev, and interesting to hear your thoughts on the Oxford-Cambridge Arc as experienced from your role in the leadership group.
Thanks very much, Kevin. And just to be clear, in case any of those you don't know me, I'm Bev Hindle, Executive Director of the Oxford to Cambridge Arc Leadership Group. We are a group of local authorities, LEPs, working with government and work very closely with the Arc Universities group, try and develop a narrative for the Arc. And it's not all local authorities. Buckinghamshire Council and LEP are not part of that, but the rest of them are members of that. It's easy to get stray into the chat conversation, Kevin, and I might pick up a few of those anyways, but I'll try and stick to where I was going to originally go, but I do think it covers off a little bit. I think for me, there's a fundamental question. Is what we're doing now so excellent that we shouldn't be looking at different models and different ways of doing things? I personally don't think so. I think there's an opportunity here that something like the spatial framework gives us, not just as a model for other regions nationally, but for an opportunity to bridge that gap between the national planning policy framework at a national level and what's happening at local plans. I think, and I'll come back to the opportunity in a moment. Catriona will know I will say this, and apologies, Catriona, I'm saying it first. We are still suffering the cost of tearing down strategic planning in this country, and the bodges that were put in place to be able to address some of those things, I think, are some of the issues we're seeing coming out of the chat. And this is an opportunity for us to try and fill some of that space, and I welcome it, although I acknowledge there are some challenges with it, and Adele has a big job ahead of her. But anytime government gives you a direct opportunity to engage and shape national planning and transport policy, we should take it. We do not get that kind of an opportunity through the MPPF. We are consulted, but we are not so directly engaged in shaping it. And I think absolutely there's an opportunity for us to grab hold of and take advantage of. And I want to pick up the stage we're at now, because we're a long way away from arguing about what policy should be in this thing or what it says and doesn't say. We are being asked what we think about a vision. The government hasn't even taken the opportunity of throwing a vision at us. They've actually asked us what we think. And we should take that opportunity to tell them what we think. That visions can somehow be just dismissed as being fluffy and woolly and not particularly defensible at examination. But there's a key point here, and I think it came up in Steve's presentation. If you're going to develop the outcomes and then ultimately the performance measures that tells you whether you're reaching those outcomes and then be held to publicly accountable, somewhere that had to start through the vision process. If we're going to change those performance outcomes away from just stagnant targets like how many houses did you build or not build, and we're going to move into targets like, are our people healthy? Are our people happy? Are we actually delivering against a climate change legal requirement? Then you're going to have a vision and the outcomes defined that reflect that. So this is an incredibly important stage of the plan making, or in this case, policy making process, that we should not miss, because it is a legitimate opportunity to shape that. And if we don't take that, I think it's going to be harder for us to hold government to account later for why or why not they didn't actually approach things in the way we wanted them to. I think there's another point here around horses for courses. I think there is a reality. I think there is a legitimacy, and I think there is a frustration that we don't yet know what space is the spatial framework taking. Is it taking space away from local plans? Is it duplicating or replicating other strategies and plans across the region or nationally? I think there is a point where there are some plans that are done best at scale. There are some that are very much done best at local. And I'll give you two examples. I'm not advocating these, but I'm certainly giving you two examples where we don't get a fair conversation. Local planners trying to do local plans and trying to set policies for 30-year visions struggle in an evidence-based way to be able to demonstrate how that's going to be deliverable. I ran into this when I was leading the Oxfordshire plan. I know that's still a challenge for that group in Oxfordshire. How do you defend the back end of your plan? With all due respect, that is about ambition and that is about vision, because it's very difficult to be certain of it. And yet you're being tested against a regime that says you have to be certain. So the spatial framework gives the opportunity to be able to fill some of that gap around that certainty and to maybe give a little bit of space to be able to think about and being flexible about what the future might bring. And particularly around things like climate change. We're not going to get there if we expect every local player to somehow aggregate up to the solution. We have to have top down and bottom up. And I think the spatial framework has an opportunity to set policy direction, set infrastructure expectation that can help us to deliver against that. I think there's also a point here where we absolutely, and again, I'm not advocating it, and it is going to come out, but where do new settlements ever get a proper legitimate conversation going through a local plan process? Not very often, very, very rare. And I think if we're going to properly have a debate with the public about where future growth goes, whatever that number is, because you know what, 500,000 is still a big number. And the reality is we should have all those options on the table somewhere so that we can properly debate which ones provide the best opportunities and least consequences, or at least negative consequences. We have an opportunity through the spatial framework to perhaps do that. And I think that's something we should not miss, because we might find along the way, actually, there's some decent solutions there that at scale we can look at, but never would have come into our scope of view when we were doing it through a local or even a sub-regional plan. I guess the last thing I'll say is going back to this opportunity point. We have an opportunity here to embed well-being into well-being of people and places. I take that point that was in the chat. I think that's right. And certainly that's what I saw was being promoted through the Oxfordshire Vision they've recently sort of published, which is that well-being of all of us point. We have an ability to start to test these policies against that ambition. We have an ability to actually pick up inclusive prosperity. Thank you, Rupert, for bringing it up in the chat. I think there's a real opportunity to talk about productivity and prosperity that isn't just how many jobs, how many people, how many homes. It's much more intuitive around an ARC area of innovation should be able to come up with ways to manage that relationship. So it is about sustainable growth, not just about population or projected job growth. I think there's a real opportunity to push clean and green. We've been certainly advocating that heavily through our environment principles we've developed as a leadership group. And I believe the government wants us to be able to push that further. That says, okay, you've talked about principles. What does that start to look like in delivery terms so that we can start to actually articulate what doubling nature as a headline might actually mean on the ground? And I think there's an opportunity for the framework to pick up some of those directions so that wider communities might be able to understand their part in it. Because the reality is, not everybody's going to be able to deliver a community forest, or not everybody's going to be able to deliver a canal, but we might be able to find across that whole geography, we can actually meet those targets around net gains of biodiversity, environmental net gain overall. And then lastly, as a planner, it'd be disappointing not to say this otherwise, I don't see sustainable development happening in the current system. I just simply don't, and we need help. And I think the ability to look at this thing in a different scope, at a different scale, and certainly in this area, if it can't be delivered in this area, then I really struggle to think in other areas where it's going to be able to do that with the innovation behind it, with the academic and expertise behind us, with the entrepreneurial spirit behind us. There must be an opportunity to bring these things together to look at policy making and planning and transport in a different way, so that we don't just end up at the list with a big long list of road schemes or rail schemes or things to deliver. We've actually thought through what do we need to be able to deliver a better and more sustainable future. So I absolutely advocate this piece of work. It's not without risk, it's not without controversy, and it certainly will raise lots of concerns. But if you want to have an argument about housing numbers, that's down the hall to the right. If you want to talk about the quality of places in the future, I think this is the place to be focused. And this is a real opportunity that we shouldn't be missed. Kevin, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bev. So it's not just about quanta and numbers and data. There's a bigger, partly philosophical, but also the translation into reality in terms of sustainability that this scale of thinking and collaboration offers. Thanks very much. We're going to move on to our second presenter for this stage, and that's Joe Lancaster. I've already introduced Joe in terms of Joe's role at Huntingdonshire District Council, but also it's another person that we're delighted to have on the panel who's got direct experience of some of the ongoing work within the ARC. Welcome, Joe. Over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for giving me some space on the agenda. So again, I'm here not, as Stephen said, not as a representative of my organisation, but as a sponsor for one of the work streams on the ARC. And I'll sort of pick up where Bev left off, which is around this opportunity. So, you know, I'm a planner, worked in local government for a long time, over 30 years, which is a ridiculous position to find myself in. But, you know, my starting proposition is we could carry on doing what we've been doing. But my question is, will that address the real problems that we know exist, not just for this current generation, but for generations to come? So I'm going to just talk a little bit about my role in sponsoring the work stream. And placemaking is obviously at the heart of the work stream that I'm engaged with. And the role of sponsorship for me has a number of different strands, which sort of tie into some of the opportunities that this the spatial framework is providing for us. So I see my role very much around advocacy. It's about convening spaces where conversations can happen, not just within the 21 local planning authorities, but much in a much broader group. So Bev's alluded to, you know, the opportunities to collaborate with the Arc Universities group, with the political leaders across the political spectrum, talking about these things. And you know, it's a really refreshing opportunity for people to just think slightly differently. Which takes me on to the second strand, which is one about ownership. So conventionally, when we talk about spatial things, the assumption is it equals planning. And my pitch on this is, you know, although I'm sitting here as a planner, I don't think this is about planning. This is about a much broader group of people who can bring a whole different perspective on this. You know, again, Steve Quartermain was talking about the local plan system. I don't think anybody's going to disagree that the existing system is broken. And this is an opportunity to reset those ambitions, to try and come up with a spatial ambition, which involves a much richer blend of professional inputs, but more fundamentally, and a number of you have picked it up in the chat already, it is that thing about bottom up. You know, genuinely getting community engagement at the heart of the new ambition that we set for our areas, and I think it's a massive shift in focus for all of us. Now, you know, do I have all of the answers to the questions that are being posed? I don't. I genuinely don't have all of the answers. But I think the challenge for us is to try and imagine a different way of working. So the third strand of the sort of sponsorship role as I see it is to try and shift the focus of conversation around planning from governance to something around outcomes. And again, you know, cutting back to Steve's earlier presentation about the local plan system and all of the issues in the local plan system, you know, we do get drawn into conversations about inquiries and inspections and how the process could or should work. And what we always fall short on is that thing about achieving valuable outcomes that are meaningful for the communities that either live in an area or will live in the area in the future. And I think we've seen the failure of the duty to cooperate to really step into that space of cross-boundary collaboration. And even where there is a degree of cooperation and collaboration, we've got great working relationships in parts of southern Cambridgeshire, it still doesn't deliver what we need across the broader area. And then the final point around sponsorship for me is a really important one, and you know, I've prioritized this today because this is something that's so fundamental to me, which is about championing that opportunity to talk and to draw across from the rich sources of information that exist out there. There's some really inspiring stories that are already being told about different ways of developing sustainable communities, about how we build communities from a much more different perspective. And you know, whether you're on the Jane Jacobs chaos end of the spectrum or the Ebenezer Howard sort of manicured end of the spectrum, there is lots and lots of evidence now about how sustainable communities can be shaped by different value sets, but can still generate a place where many different types of people want to live, but more fundamentally choose to build a life. and that for me is at the heart of it. So, you know, I think that in sort of brief summary, the opportunity that we've got here is to do something different. It is scary because there are no rules, there are no boundaries, there is no blueprint for this, but it's an opportunity, and if we don't take the opportunity, we are going to just get stuck in the existing cycle that we have of trying our best but never quite managing to land what we need to do. And I think, you know, if we create big visions, will we deliver it in its entirety? Probably not. But actually, a near miss on a big ambition is going to deliver much better outcomes than just treading water or challenging the status quo through nibbling away at the edges. So, you know, I'm wholeheartedly throwing my shoulder to the wheel on this one, and I think it's an opportunity that we shouldn't shy away from. But as I said, you know, do we have all of the answers for this? We certainly don't. But it's a great opportunity to talk it through. So I'll pause there and leave time for others to contribute.
Thank you, Joe. So a dialogue space with a greater focus on thinking about outcomes rather than simply processes. Thanks very much, Joe. We're going to move on to Catriona next. Catriona Riddell. Welcome, Catriona. Again, referenced some of your background earlier, and I know you've got a long-standing professional history in this sector across the Southeast, and we're interested in your perspective. Welcome, Catriona.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about this because I think for the first time in, you know, a long time, we're talking about good strategic planning. So I'm really optimistic about this, and I'm optimistic because I think so far the right players are involved. But my starting point here is that why stop at the Arc? You know, this is a blueprint for other places. There are differences that would have to be applied in terms of some of the aspects of it, but generally, it's a model that we should be attempting and the government should be applying to other parts. Strategic planning isn't, as Joe has just said, it's not a big local plan. It's not a big statutory development plan. It's a long-term, high-level place-based investment framework, and it's about delivering good growth. So it goes way beyond planning. It's about dealing with some of these really big challenges we've got around climate change. It's around you know, economic recovery and long-term growth. It's about environmental resilience, changing demographics, and infrastructure needs. And I sort of disagree around, perhaps not disagree with Steve, but I think I would take the view is that having been involved in statutory and non-statutory and trying to do it every which way, I think where we've got to a sort of a framework that doesn't sit within a rigid statutory development plan system has to be the way forward. And I think our COVID experience and the immediate change in how we communicate around digital technology, our past experience in 2008 with the economic recession, I think, and just the changing technology generally, I think they sort of basically make the point. We need a resilient system, we need a responsive system, we need somewhere that has that long-term vision at the heart of it. But the way that we deliver that vision is going to be able to respond to changing circumstances and changing context. And right now, the government, you know, they've said they're going to act to cooperate, they've got a levelling up agenda. This is time now to strike and get this new system in place. But I think one of the things that I'm excited about in terms of the OxCam Arc and the way it can be used elsewhere, and you know, there's lots of debate around how communities are involved or not. But this is about resetting relationships. This is about resetting values, and this is about that magic top-down, bottom-up, but getting everybody in the right place to do the right thing. And I think having a framework built around that shared vision, and I think as Joe and Bev said, with really clearly articulated outcomes, you know, what are we trying to achieve over the next 10, 20, 30 years? And that important point about what does it look like? What are the measurements of success? And I love the fact that, you know, Bev's thinking around metrics around happiness. Why not? It can't just be about GDP and housing numbers. It has to be much more than that if we're going to get buy-in. So in terms of just resetting relationships and dealing with that institutional messiness that everybody seems to talk about, you know, there's just too many players and they've all got different perspectives, priorities, they all operate in different timescales. So we need to cut across that, and we need that collective leadership that needs to be provided in strategic planning. We need a new contract between central and local government. I think we need to make sure that government agencies, Homes England, Highways England, Environment Agency, Natural England, all of them are very much tied into that new contract, and that new contract is enforceable all the way through to the delivery mechanisms, which includes local plans, which includes local transport plans, and other plans and strategies. We also need that direct link to government to build legitimacy and accountability, and to ensure that cross-government support. I mean, the Arc's got that in spades at the moment with Adele and her team. We need that everywhere, and if we can get somebody, you know, a place leader, the government's new place leader, or some form of senior responsible officer within government that can own or be part of strategic planning right across the country, different strategic planning models across the country, then I think that's a good thing, because frankly, it can't just be about MHCLG. Every government department and agency has a role to play in delivering good growth. And just finally, I think there's a couple of points, I guess, that, you know, in terms of delivering this, it can't just be about a framework that sets a vision and strategy. It has to be deliverable. We need a clear mandate from government, and I do like the way that the framework has been set up as government policy. We've had that in the past through regional planning guidance, but it does need to have some certification to say this has a mandate from government, therefore it is important and it must be delivered through the statutory planning system and other processes. And that also has to bind in the utility companies, the developers, and everybody else who has a role to play. You've got to have that robust governance that cuts across complicated roles, territorial responsibilities, and importantly, cultures. You know, counties have different cultures from districts, combined authorities have different cultures, LEPs have different cultures. Everybody, the communities, different parts across strategic areas, there's different cultures and different priorities. So we need something that can cut across that and be resilient over long term. And I'm a big fan of growth boards or something like that, that as different players or partners change, that body doesn't implode, it can still continue delivering, and there is some sort of consistency in terms of the delivery. So I guess the answer to the question, and I've not done, there's a huge amount of detail in there, but I guess the answer to the exam question is, can the Arc be used as a model for elsewhere? Of course it can. There are subtle differences. I can't imagine the government will have its own in-house technical team for every part of the country, and it shouldn't do if we're going to do this properly. And we don't even know how the Arc's going to be properly tested, if whether it'll have an examination or something like that. So there's issues that we need to look at. But on the whole, I think this is a great model to take forward, and I'm just excited about the fact that we're talking about strategic planning properly for a first time in a very long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Catriona. So you're suggesting this is important because it's a strategic planning initiative, and that it could have leading edge lessons for elsewhere, not necessarily as a rigid format or blueprint. Other variants could be used, but that the level of scale of collaborative thinking and practice is what's important. I'm detecting from what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key issues, you know, it doesn't have to cover everything, but government needs to set out the core issues that each of these frameworks needs to address. And a lot of that is around these big issues. These, you know, strategic planning is that plays that pivotal role between national and local. It delivers national priorities, but it does it in a way that reflects local context and circumstances. And that's what strategic planning at the heart is. And that's what the government needs to address.
Thanks, Catriona. And that kind of intermediate position between government and more localized communities and local authorities, it has come through several of the presentations. I'm now going to pass on to our fourth panelist, Vincent Goodstadt. Again, many of you will know Vincent from his different roles, and like Catriona, he has a long history of working in strategic planning and advising both national level, strategic level, and working on international partnerships on it. So Vincent, and Vincent, like a number of the presenters, lives in the Arc corridor, if I can call it that, at the Oxford end. So your thoughts, I guess, Vincent, both as a resident and a practicing planner.
Thanks very much, Kevin. And obviously a lot's been covered already in what in fact has been said, and I don't want to repeat them or repeat the questions, but I'd like to make a few comments based upon, first of all, having worked across the Arc, never mind having lived in it in all the 3 major cities, but also drawing upon some general comments of experience of having worked with on plans of similar sized area, complexity and population in what we could call a polycentric region, which has its own special needs. And first, a couple of points. I'd like to touch on the issues about the Arc itself that lie at the heart of many of the conflicting views and skepticism that I've seen in the chat box and have heard even before I came to this session. First of all, the Arc brings together 3 very distinct city regions, which actually some would argue is an artificial construct as a single entity. It's not a coherent economic region, and each of those has its own problems, its own character, different national roles and relationships. And therefore, the question is, why do it for this area? I think it's an academic point, and it very much echo what Bev says about the fact it is being done in the first place, and I'll come back to that. But we need to recognize that whatever you think about these areas and the interdependencies, they have a common relationship to London. They are all focused on the growth that actually is linked to or generated out of London, as highlighted in recent reports. And they all require the same need for a coherent and consistent narrative. So even if, whatever the shape of the spatial strategy, the issues they're dealing with are very similar in their nature, even if the responses for each part is slightly different or very different. The second concern is one that I really hasn't been much discussed, but it's actually the growing interdependencies of regions and nations in the UK, and therefore the importance of the Arc addressing the external relationships and interdependencies. In the chat box, there's reference, I think, by Mike Batty to the growing relationship to down towards the south and the M4 corridor, but they're not just that, it's also to the Midlands, to the north. And the debate should be as much about the internal spatial structure as the spatial relationship to the rest of the UK. And if I take one example from the work of the UK 2070 Commission, the question is, what is the impact going to be of the levelling up agenda? The calculations that have been done by Cambridge University suggest that it could actually take the pressure off the Arc, off the southeast as a whole, and a share of that will be off the Arc, of something like 700,000 jobs over a 10-year period. And therefore the aspirations to double the economic clout of this area in that time might actually be part achieved by taking off some of the pressure that it has anyway and creating headroom for those things it can uniquely do. But that relationship nationally has not been discussed. It needs to. And in effect, I'm saying it's going to be essential that any spatial strategy of the Arc is set within its national context under which it will be operating. Otherwise, it's a self-contained document. I'd like also now to just touch on some of the wider issues that I see from my experience elsewhere. From when I talked about areas I've been involved with, they've been from the Randstad in Holland, which some of you know, the Rust Belt in the US, and also even in a rather slightly different context, the Casablanca, the Rabat region. And although they're very different in nature and very different culturally and legally, they have all needed a strategic spatial plan in the armory of tools they have in delivering and managing the change they want. And that's the core of the debate actually about the Arc. It's not a local plan, as Catriona say. To think of it just as being a local plan writ large would to get it totally wrong. It's about shifting the dial on how this area operates and being a basis for new programs of investment and resource allocation. So in a sense, the overriding point I'd want to make, and for us to bear in mind, it almost doesn't matter what is in the document that comes out next week or the week after or whenever. The point is, it is being produced. It will be the first iteration, and it will bring the debate together in a coherent way. You may not agree with that, but it will be there. It will definitely not be complete. It definitely will not be right in total or in detail, but it will set a stake in the ground about a better future than we have on the trajectory we're currently on. Successful places have had successful plans, but they don't achieve that by their first iteration. They do it by subsequent sustained strategic planning in the area. And having said that, I want to touch on what makes a plan effective. It's really to do with what has already been highlighted, the quality of its technical analysis, and I'm not sure whether there's agreement on that, the responsibilities and powers to deliver, which has been the heart of so many of the comments raised, and the engagement processes that are used. And one thing for sure is that this area does not have the formal powers to deliver it. But it can compensate. We find that the power of the argument was very much used in Scotland to keep areas together for strategic planning. And in Germany, it was the processes of collaboration. So I think we just should accept that the people who are planning this area are doing a one-hand time behind their back, if not both hands at times, in terms of their capacity to deliver. The powers and responsibilities are fragmented. There's a distinct risk, therefore, that this plan for the Arc could end up just as a bidding document for resources or a shopping list to choose out pet schemes, or even become so cast in stone that it lacks capacity to refresh itself and adapt to change. And so those are quite critical, but it's not a reason for inaction. It's actually the reverse. The level of fragmentation, the level of lack of capacity to deliver plans that we have is probably the biggest argument why we need to now move back to more effective strategic planning. All the issues raised in the chat line that I've read are all real and need to be faced up to. They are not new, however. None of them are, and none of them are insuperable. The places I worked in have had the same problems but have overcome them. And with all the debate we're going to have today and going on forward is there is an alternative, and that is to carry on as we're doing and don't pretend that there is no de facto strategy for the Arc area. There is one, and it's reflected in the outcomes. And as Bev has so articulately said, none of us want it. And if it's not what we want, we've got to find a better way. And at the moment, the Arc and the thinking on that, in principle, offers more hope than anything else that I've seen put forward. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Vincent. There's some really interesting themes both in the presentations we've just had, and I think what we've got is in the chat. You've picked up some of them, Vincent. Is the one I'm just going to start off with you and then go to some of the things from the chat. But one of the key ones you referenced that jumps out to me is this sustained one, because England in particular doesn't have a strong tradition. I mean, it has occasionally, one can think of the Southeast, but also the North was referenced by Steve Quartermain. There have been other ones in different parts of the country. Sustained regional planning and sometimes sub-regional planning isn't something England has been very good at as compared with other countries, even in the British Isles and certainly further afield. Is that a political issue? Is it a cultural thing? Why do we not manage to do sustained planning of a scale beyond, say, a local authority?
If you want me to answer that, obviously it's very easy to oversimplify it. But if there's one thing that has come out of the work of the UK 2070 Commission, I really do advise you to read the documents. It is actually the process by which we make decisions. They are stop-start, and this is not just planning, it's across the board. You could almost take any arm of government and you have this. Stop-start, under-resourced, project-based rather than program-based, and subject to change as such. But more particularly, we have a situation where we are the most centralized government or state in Europe, and if not in the Western world. And in some sense, it's an irony there, because we ought to be able to do things better at a street level. But actually, it has become part of the problem. And actually, what the government is doing, I see, and across a whole range of things, is moving in a kind of incremental way, but moving away and seeking to get things done in a way that's much more sensitive to the localities and the needs, to become more spatial in the way it makes decisions. It needs to go further. But I think the problem is we've been far too spatial at a national level. We've said one policy fits all, which it doesn't. And actually, this is a way of starting that process. I think that different models will be used in different parts of the country, but the key thing is to recognize that the diversity of the country is so great, the inequalities are so great, that one policy at one level at a national level will not suit action at local levels. They have to be operated and evolved and tailored to the localities, but at a strategic level.
Thanks, Vincent. I'm going to pick up something that linked to that, this issue of sustain. I'm going to pick up the reinvention one, which Catriona picked up to some degree. I'm going to go to Henk Bouwman of Metrex, because Henk raised the issue of reinvention and sort of sometimes time after time. And I think at the end of your comment, Henk, you said there are some great examples, including elsewhere in Europe. And I just wondered if there are any that you could point us in the direction of, Henk. If you want to unmute.
Hello. Yes.
Hi, Henk. Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Well, I also mentioned that, as Vincent Goodstadt said, maybe only 30%, if not even less, of the European metropolitan regions or regions have a formal, sort of formal body, a formal authority. So in that sense, it is in general often based on a collaboration. And I think also David Locke said, you know, you look at, when you look at examples in France, often that is based on collaboration. So yeah, it's maybe part of the culture, as Vincent said. I think when you look at examples, he mentioned the Randstad, which consists of 4 big cities and a whole number of small cities. There is no formal there's no formal body at all. There's hardly, let's say, regional bodies, because, for instance, the metropolitan region of Amsterdam is also a collaboration between mayors and not, let's say, a formal body. But the thing is that they see apparently a sort of common ground, the common issues that they need to tackle. And I think what was not mentioned yet by Vincent, but he mentioned a lot, but is, of course, there are common challenges like climate change. And some people mentioned, of course, the upcoming COP. You know, that's an ongoing thing, but we need to address very urgent transition challenges. And for that, you need to sort of collaborate. And I think we have discussed that earlier on in the Arc. I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, in a meeting also in Milton Keynes. I think when you compare the region, let's say, to other areas in Europe, I would look at, for instance, Bonn and Cologne. I would look at areas around Grenoble, where you have the sort of polycentric cities, let's say, polycentric regions, which are very well off, let's say, in terms of collaboration, and also explaining, I think, the benefits that collaboration has for people who live in those areas. And I think that is where it starts. I mean, you should not start about all kind of formal or let's say, stuff I mentioned in my chat. But maybe you should start talking about what the values, sort of common values are. And I think there is definitely something about common values in that area. By the way, we have been working a lot with the West Midlands Combined Authority. And I don't know how you are informed there, but let's say, I think what has been achieved there already in the last 4 or 5 years is really amazing. And of course, that was after a long discussion. But I think when it comes to the things like transportation, but also cohesion, all kind of social politics, it's slowly sort of growing, and it's not so much about who has the power, but it's actually who can really address, let's say, the big issues that you all face. So I think even next door, more or less, in Birmingham, you have a great example.
Thanks, Henk. So that bit about the transferability or translatability to other geographies and networks, whether they're polycentric or centric. I mean, some of the questions are coming through in the comments rather about different scales at European, Eastern England. There are different ones applying all the way out to Wales, Scotland and Ireland, where a lot of this is being applied to. A lot has come through on communities, imposition, demographics, the micro localities, urban, rural. I'm going to pick up 1 or 2 of those while we've got time in the next 5 or 6 minutes. I want to go to Georgia Bettina Watson, who's been making a couple of comments on the social and demographics. Georgia, do you want to say something about that? Is it knowing the data and what's happening within the demographics within different parts of the Arc, or is it something different that you're expressing?
Yeah, it came up as a research we carried out on healthy new towns, and that included new settlement in Cambridge, Northstowe, Bicester, Barton, etc. And what we discovered, plus in additional towns, etc., that there are pockets of deprivation in the whole of the Arc sub-region, that there are a lot of social, health, economic, and other inequalities that are not addressed or able to be addressed presently. And that also impacts on the future generation in terms of health, well-being, and benefits, as well as on the other spectrum of aging population. And I think this particular region is very critical in terms of making the decisions that embrace that. And therefore, we are not only looking how we deliver new settlements through housing, villages, etc., and therefore a lot of deprivation in rural communities, but that we look at bottom-up approach in terms of what is there. Data is missing. There are some statistics that are nationally captured, but when you go into individual places, data is much richer. So the work that I think Bev Hindle mentioned about Rosie Rowe's work, I'm part of this advisory group, is also to look specifically at other communities, and they need to be included in all this if we are going to deliver something that is fit for purpose for 21st century, delivers well-being and healthy communities. And I think this is where I see the role of universities in the region, collecting that information and discussing what we can do with that particular approach. But on the other spectrum, it's also looking at a larger picture holistically and looking at what is the impact of pandemic. That already suggests different models of placemaking, different models of transportation, etc. And whilst we see the benefit of collaboration between university research and development in biomedical, etc., I think we need to connect to other aspects of planning and delivery, which includes what kind of work placements we have, what kind of jobs we create, etc. And I think this more holistic vision needs to be connected into what is already in the sub-region.
Thanks, Georgia. So the universities, with their access to data, to research, both local and comparative, could play a much bigger role in helping the Arc and indeed the communities in and around the Arc progress by being a kind of support player, a support part. I'm clear that some of them are, but I think what you're saying is they could play a stronger role.
Absolutely, and I think this is where, again, strategic thinking that came from all the panel presenters and earlier presenters is not to just focus on one particular locality, etc. We need to have ambition whereby we may say, okay, in order to use that vision, etc., we also need benchmarking where we are today, and we don't always have rich data, particularly when it comes to health inequalities. They are very rough, they're not very specific. And I think setting up an agenda that universities can then engage in delivering through surveys and other methods is going to help and inform also how we create vision that is also delivering healthy communities.
Kevin, can I come in? It's Joe Lancaster.
Hi, Joe. Yes, please.
Yeah. So Georgia, I agree entirely with what you've said. I mean, the significance of the landscape within the Arc is really important. It is a very, very mixed area between rural and urban focus. But the place theme, and this is why I'm such an advocate of this type of approach, the place theme has to embody the social elements as well as the physical elements. So when we're talking about placemaking in the Arc context, we're talking about strategic and spatial choices. Of course we are, and of course we're talking about distinctive and natural places. But we are also talking about active and social places where people can thrive, where they can live a healthy and well life. And then there's also the flip side of that, which you've also alluded to, which is around productive and enterprising places where people can have businesses that are able to recruit the right type of people because the skills platforms are there, and building that quality of life stuff into what is basically a spatial document is absolutely fundamental, that distinguishes the spatial framework from the type of planning policy products that we have at the moment. So it is a very, very difficult balance to strike, and the Arc Universities group are embracing this and helping us immensely. But the big bit for me that we have to draw to the table on this one is the whole sector around health, because we've got lots of evidence bases and lots of knowledge around different bits of the agenda, but to get that levelling up up in terms of the health agenda and dealing with those inequalities, we need to have all of the government departments lined up behind HCLG to make this as successful as it should be.
I totally agree with you. And I think this is where collectively and individually with different working groups and teams, effort can be made to perhaps seek additional resources that would facilitate more sharing of the knowledge. And I think by doing that, we're also collaborating more between us, sharing that knowledge and engaging also with local people on the ground. But I think when it comes to rural communities, my experience from other projects suggests that if they're not growing in the spectrum of planned growth, they may be bypassed. And this is where I'm saying the whole region, not just those places that we are looking at in terms of growth. We need to address in terms of how we improve quality of life, exactly what you are saying, Joe, and also use that knowledge to help everybody in the community around us, be it urban, be it rural, and develop that capacity for delivery. And I think if anything, the capacity to deliver health, we are now looking at a backlog of dealing with illnesses, etc. It also needs to look at new methods and delivery methods of healthcare and how we can distribute that between different organizations, local authorities, etc. So there is both conceptual thinking, but also operational strategy, how we can do it. And I totally agree with you, particularly with the place working stream, that it is looked at. All I'm suggesting is that we could perhaps more collaborate between different teams. And I know that different teams within universities do a lot of research, but they don't always share all the data and everything between each other. And I'm basically saying that we can share a bit more between us in order to inform different work streams.
Can I come in, Kevin?
Last point, Vincent, last point. Yes, please.
Because the point that's being raised by Georgia is actually quite central. There is a major confusion about what levelling up is in this country. And in fact, a polarization in seeing it as a north-south or divide, or a town versus city, or a town country, urban and rural. And if you actually look at the work that's been done, and I do really seriously ask you to look at it, we have to move away from that rhetoric. The issues of levelling up that's required in all places is a very complex one and needs actually to be clarified in terms of national policies and priorities. And it is therefore quite critical to understand that the issues of rural deprivation are very different in nature to the urban ones. The areas of deprivation and areas of growth are very different in their cause. Some of the most equal places in the country are actually the poorest. This is the irony. And we need to therefore have a much more sophisticated conversation. And I've been concerned that in the debate about in the Southeast particularly, and in some of the discussions on the Arc, they've actually started to polarize that debate and actually, instead of seeing that the solution to their own problems are all linked. And that's why I raised the issue about understanding the balance of the economic geography in the country is as central to the future of the Arc as any other question that's been asked.
Thanks, Vincent, and thanks everyone who's both commented in the chat, because some of you have given lengthy and detailed considerations and examples and arguments. So we appreciate that, and we hope everyone who's been able to follow that has enjoyed it. Thanks to all the panelists who've been on in that second part, complementing the presentations from the first one. I think we've got something here as a concept. And I know with others who've been on this call, I worked on some aspects of that in the early 2000s on things like the South Midlands work. There's something that has an economic rationale, I think, in the early days in terms of what it could contribute to the UK economy and even particularly the balance and driver for England. We've had a strong argument that it needs to be embedded in the planning system in order to have relevance and transparency and connection and traction, I guess, with places like Treasury and so on to bring investment forward for infrastructure. Many of you have raised the issue about the risk of top-down imposition on people and communities at different scales. Urban neighborhoods, but particularly I think small towns and rural is coming through as the sense that it could be marginalized. However, we've had the case come through from a number of you that this is an important scale of collaboration. It's not a different layer of government necessarily, but it's somewhere that both connects to and from national level scale and more localized local authority and sub-local authority scale in terms of communities. And it's important interface. And the argument that we heard earlier in the second phase was that it allows us to address things like carbon and climate change and biodiversity in a way that looks beyond the more challenging local authority scale. I think that if it's done well, it may provide some kind of treasury link, and it could influence decisions in the future, but I think we've got to watch and see if that's possible. I think that it affords an opportunity to rethink bottom up if we can engage with people, and where we started at the beginning with Adele's presentation, that seems to be the aspiration behind the work coming out that we'll be seeing shortly in terms of the vision consultation, but let's see how that plays out. But that's in the context where, as a number of you have picked up, we seem to have a serious mistrust issue with government and government type institutions. And in my professional career, which is, as some of you know, rather long, I have never seen such distrust of government institutions, even going back to the 80s and 70s. The last decade, and particularly the last 5 years, there's a complete lack of trust because the delivery and the follow through and anything that's said. And I think that makes the work of Adele and her colleagues very hard. So however well-intentioned it is, there's going to be huge amounts of distrust around in different parts of the country in terms of what could be taken forward, even when people agree with the strategy and the intent. So that distrust element is a big part. But as we heard from Bev and others, perhaps we're at a point where we actually have an opportunity. What Adele said is coming out in the next few weeks as a consultation for 3 months. Maybe it's an opportunity to engage with and influence policy that will have some kind of national and local status. And maybe we can do something that builds from the bottom up and from the middle and the sideways elements of different authorities. So maybe we have a window to do something a little bit differently. And as Catriona said, this might be a model for doing things in other parts of the country and help leveling up elsewhere. So I think we've got a really interesting exposition of ideas. We haven't got bogged down in, let's say, local plan deadlines or housing numbers. We've actually had a quite broad-ranging debate, and I really appreciate all the preparation work that our presenters have put in to get us to this point today. And a huge thank you to everyone who's joined today, because you've all contributed in your own way through the chat. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to pick up every issue, but thanks everyone for joining. We hope that we may do a follow-up event once the consultation is out. So if you'd like to do that, if you'd like us to do that, please say so in the chat, and we might arrange something with Adele where we can have a follow-up and maybe broaden out this conversation and engage more people. In the meantime, I want to thank all the speakers that we've had today, all three of them in the first session. I want to thank all our panelists who joined in the second session, to Stuart Turner of the AOU, who's put a phenomenal amount of work in preparing this over a long period. And we've had various points where we thought we were going to run it, and then we pushed it back because we thought that we would have the document launched this week. To Linda Dirtnell from the Planning Officer Society, who has also put a lot of work in supporting and help us access speakers and colleagues. So thanks very much, Linda, for that. Great to be working with you again. And finally, my colleagues at the Academy, Steve, Kaylin and Linda, who Steve's not on today, but has been involved in the preparation, Kaylin and Linda, who've been supporting us today. But a big thank you again to all of you as participants for joining. I know you've got different backgrounds. Many are coming from being actively involved in this, or skeptical, or grappling with, how on earth can we make this work, because it's probably going to be landing on your desk soon. So let's all keep the conversations open. I think that the point about we've got dialogue space, let's use it, and let's make the most of the opportunity to influence things that we can have in the coming weeks and months. Thanks very much for everybody joining, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Stay safe. Bye for now.